For centuries, humans have been growing alongside our botanical brethren. Our histories have mixed and mingled to bring us modern medical marvels, faded folklore, and everything in between. Of course, in order to understand the plant, we have to start with its roots. I'm M. Grubner Gaddis, and this is Rooted. Hello, and welcome back to Lightly Rooted, a show where I ask questions and do my best to answer them based on whatever the internet tells me, tells you, and whatever random facts enter my brain after that. It's again called Lightly Rooted because unlike our regular show, this is unscripted and I'm doing the research with you in real time. So nothing I say is 100% true. Always do your research. It's more or less just taking you through kind of what my process is when I just start researching the show, and hopefully introducing you to some questions and topics you haven't thought of to ask, or that you've been wondering and we haven't talked about yet. Today, though, we don't have to be too worried about if what I'm saying is 100% factual, because we're throwing it all the way back to the plants of Victorian medicine. Now, if you know me at all, you know that I have a weird obsession with old-timey Victorian, cure-alls, mostly because they sound awful, right? Like, my friend Danielle, shout out Danielle, she hosts Tea Time Oddities, and she did an entire episode on what is my obsession with Victorian toothworm demons, and basically just ancient dentistry, but I'm also super interested in leeches and all of that kind of weird, old-timey, scary medical practice, mostly because it reminds me to be grateful about what going to the doctors is like today. So without further ado, let's dig into the herbs that Victorians used for their medicinal properties. Should be interesting. So we're starting off with an article from Victorian Homes. And they're kind of just listing them out. So the first one they have is bee balm. Today, a lot of us grow bee balm in our gardens to attract pollinator friends and just because it's like a cutie little flower. White bee balm is edible, they say, and used to make medicine that was an antiseptic, diuretic, and used for just general sickness. They believed this was most effective by inhaling the steam. It's also called wild bergamot. So this is something we do still see popping up. I do believe wild bergamot is actually an active ingredient in Ricola. So if you use those cough drops, shout out to Victorian medicine, I guess. Also catmint, which is related to catnip. It is, again, this one's actually still super popular. I actually grow it in my garden as well. And Victorians used to use this as a tea to kind of make you sleepy. And it's just kind of mint. Really, so it works the same way a lot of mint does, right? It's antiseptic, kind of, and antimicrobial, and it's just a very vigorous grower, so it's pretty easy to keep. Chamomile, which again we still use today, lavender and dill, feverfew, which is just, it looks like a tiny little daisy. It was used actually primarily to treat aches and pains, especially like tooth pain, and it can kind of cause a little bit of a nummy feeling. But it's kind of a fun one. I'm sure we'll dig into that on the show. And lamb's ear. Now, this was like kind of an old-timey Band-Aid before Band-Aids were really popular. So in the Victorian era, they were like, what leaves are absorbent? Lamb's ear was typically used as like a Band-Aid, but also sometimes as a menstrual pad because it has like a very soft, fuzzy leaf that can kind of be stuck to the skin. Especially in times where you don't have like a clean rag available to you, you can just go ahead and use that leaf as a Band-Aid to not get blood on everything. Again, lemon balm, mint, rosemary, we've talked about those. Sage. I'm skipping any of the ones that were that we still typically use, which is actually a lot of them. I was hoping we would get a little bit more into some of the potions and things, so let's see if we can't stir up a bit of trouble with that. We're going to go to bbc.uk. British history from Victorian medicine from fluke to theory. Okay, and now we're talking, in this article, they're talking a bit about how Victorian medicine came to be. So when we talk about the Victorian period, we're usually talking about the 1800s, and it's important to understand that, like, we had just started grasping germ theory kind of around this time, but there were still plenty of folks being like, germs aren't real, you're making that up, it's demons. And the 17th century, we had already... So the 1800s, the 17th century, we're dealing with a lot of shit, right? Like, literally shit. Cholera's a problem. There's all kinds of illnesses. And we are like, where is this coming from? What are we doing wrong? What have we done to spite God? And then finally, we are like, oh my gosh, dude, germ theory. How can we be more resilient against germs? How can we fight against them? So we're in this interesting crossroads. We're starting to understand how sicknesses actually work. But we're still very reliant on herbal medicines and traditional practices that science can't really explain yet. So because of that, we also have a lot of butt talkers out there who are like, here's this thing that will work. This is my snake oil. This is my Pirelli's miracle elixir. Go ahead and just dump this mixture of piss and dirt onto yourself, and then you'll grow hair. It's going to be awesome. And we also don't have regulations the way that we do now, right? Like, we haven't developed a ton of ethics around medicine. It's kind of an era we're just fucking around and finding out. Like, we really do not know. So there was a lot of like mercury, arsenic, iron, and phosphorus. And a lot of doctors were recommending things like doing a change of air, so like moving, as well as balancing. There was still a lot of the idea that you need to balance the fluids in your body. So at this time, we're seeing a lot of people recommending potions from the apothecary, some of which are poisons, or poisons that can kind of help fix a problem but cause more problems. And then our other option is like balance the liquids in your body. So make someone puke, go ahead and bleed them, give them leeches, pray for them. So it's really a complicated world. We don't have a ton of technologies. We're doing our best. We're seeing what works and what doesn't. So now they're kind of talking about how we figured out what cholera was and how to stop it, which was we stopped dumping literal shit into the streets, because we figured out that actually, like, okay, so one thing we have to understand about human waste, it's not sewage until you mix pee and poop together. And that's where things get really bad. But for a long time, like, we didn't necessarily know that. For a long time, people were, just kind of peeing and pooping in holes, and it wasn't as big of a deal. And also, we didn't all live on top of each other in cities, so we weren't, like, accidentally dumping it into drinking water, maybe, or onto our neighbors' heads. But then, we start building cities, and this weird little cheeky thing happens where we start dumping raw sewage onto our neighbors. And then we're like, why are they getting sick all the time? That's honestly kind of gross. And finally, at this time, doctors are like, hey, we think germs are real. Like, we're pretty sure we can all agree germs are real. And we think maybe dumping raw sewage on people isn't cool. And that maybe we should start, like, at least finding a way that instead of dumping it out of our window, it could go, like, under the streets where people aren't. And that made a huge difference in cholera outbreaks. Because, again, we're taking care of health and sanitation. So that was a huge thing. I know not really related to Victorian medicine, but also at this time, like, we're figuring out pasteurization, which actually proves for everyone that germs are real and that you can't just cut into people without disinfecting things. And then in this time, we're also like, hey, so in the Victorian era, there are people legitimately trying to learn medicine who are like, we think germs are real. We think we should stop pooping in the streets. But then there are just as many people out there being like, leeches are the only thing that works. We like the old ways. And then you got people in the middle who are like, if you chew on this toxic weed, yes, you'll see really scary things, but also, like, maybe you won't have a heart attack. Maybe it will help thin your blood. Looking at you, Vincent van Gogh, taking your foxglove. Like, is it the best option? No. Do we now know arsenic will kill you and that probably you shouldn't drink it? Yeah. But then we weren't really so sure. So also in Victorian medicine, it's interesting because this is when we're first starting to institutionalize medicine. This is where, and I say we as in white people, obviously colonizers come in and they change a lot of things. Medicine has existed for probably as long as humans have existed, and indigenous cultures had their own ways of practicing medicine. They weren't dumping their shit into the streets and wondering why people were getting cholera. We were doing that. White colonizers were doing that. That's who I'm referring to when we're talking about Victorian medicine. This is certainly not how indigenous cultures were practicing medicine, and honestly, they have much better track records and much more reasonable reasons for why they're doing this. Victorian era people were kind of just guessing because they decided they were much smarter than anyone else. So that's how we got here. It's wacky, it's kind of scary, but I just wanted to give that disclaimer as we're talking about this. But again, white people are suddenly like, what if we all banded together to, like, teach each other what we're learning? And, like, institutionalized it. So that it's not just, like, any Joe Schmo on the street can, like, start telling you that if you rub poop in your cut, you're going to be okay. So that's interesting. This is why it's so interesting to study Victorian medicine, because it really was where, like, modern day medicine was starting in terms of, like, Western modern medicine. But moving into that, let's, like, research a little recipe for snake oil and see if we can guess what it would do. Okay, so it turns out snake oil is not just a made-up thing. Snake oil is part of a chapter of Asian American history where there was actually medicine made out of snake oil, which, from what they're saying here, when people came over from southeastern China, they brought with them something that we referred to as snake oil because it was made from the oil of a Chinese water snake. So basically, it was filled with omega-3 acids, kind of like fish oil, and it was really good at treating joint pain and things like that. So people were rubbing it on areas that hurt after a long day, and obviously when they came to America to work for the railroad, they had a lot of aches and pains in joints, so they were using the same thing and being generous. When their American co-workers were like, gosh, my joints hurt, they were like, here, try this. It's snake oil. And then their American counterparts were like, boy, howdy, that stuff sure is good. What's in it? And they were like, oh, it's oil from a snake. And then, assuming they were smarter than everyone, they were like, oh, if it's that simple, I'll go ahead and make my own. So then they started selling snake oil that was like sometimes rattlesnake venom, sometimes it really was literally pee. Just a bunch of, like, useless nonsense. But because they didn't understand traditional Chinese medicine and they didn't take the time to learn from their coworkers, they started selling people absolutely useless oil, which is what we now refer to as snake oil. But they were so confident that they kind of just, like, devalued actual snake oil and made that invalid. Because people were like, oh. So that's kind of fun. Also, like, some of the snake oil did really bad stuff, so that wasn't great. Really not great. But, snake oil is also what brought us one of my favorite food bills here in the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which is still very complicated and fraught with problems even today. But it was the first time we were like, you guys have got to start being more upfront about what's in this. And they found that this snake oil, specifically Stanley snake oil, which was like the big bad of it all, was mostly mineral oil, beef fat, red pepper, and turpentine. Which turpentine was also like a weirdly common thing for people to use. But again, this isn't necessarily about plants. So let's go look up plants. Look, we're just on so many tangents today. I'm sorry. This is really what researching with me is like. Okay, we are looking in an article by Bust. It's called Aphrodisiacs, Elixirs, and More Dubious Medicines of the Victorian Era. Hopefully this will give us some of the salacious content I'm looking for. They say during the 18th and 19th century, patent medicines were everywhere. These various powders, potions, elixirs, and cordials were primarily peddled by quacks, some of whom purported to be doctors from respected universities like St. Andrews in Scotland. The claims they made on behalf of their products were extraordinary. According to advertisements of the era, a restorative cordial or tonic could do practically anything, from curing dropsy in children to curing impotence in men and hysteria in women. Some even proclaimed that they could cure a fellow of the desire to engage in solitary, melancholy practice, which is just, they're just talking about making you not want to masturbate. One of the most popular patent medicines of the 18th and early 19th century was Dr. Brodum's botanical syrup and restorative nervous cordial. Advertisements and testimonials for this miracle product abound. Some of the advertisements were quite lengthy. The following appeared in an 1802 edition of the Lancaster Gazette. It's really long, so I'm not going to read all of it. But that's the whole article. They also have some really interesting articles explaining that, like, masturbating for men was essentially like the same thing as hysteria for women, which is another really interesting thing about the Victorian era. Constantly, men's things were, like, seen as problems they couldn't control, and women, it was just, like, their fault for giving into their natural urge to be a woman. But for men, it was just, like, stop masturbating, you're wasting your seed, but also take this medicine so you don't want to. Crazy times. I also love reading, like, the containers and stuff we have left. So right now, I'm on a blog from chertsymuseum.org. They closed in 2015, which is honestly really sad, but I'll make sure we link this in the show notes so that you guys can see it, because it is a very, very interesting museum. They were open for a really long time. But this is called The Pills and Potions of Thomas Holloway, who was a famous Victorian apothecary. So they had a lot of different things from Thomas Holloway, from his apothecary. The first thing they show is an ointment that says it cured ulcers, sore breasts, sore heads, and bad legs. And essentially, they're kind of detailing Holloway's life. He started off as just a merchant, and he would go all over kind of helping other people sell their ointments, but that didn't make him enough money. So he started his own for Holloway's Universal Family Ointment. And then he and the guy he initially worked for would essentially fight over marketing spots. So really like the original Coke versus Pepsi. But eventually Holloway was arrested for going bankrupt and his mom bailed him out. And so then immediately he was like, I know, I have got to make something to make women insecure. So he started making digestive pills and moved to London. And then he got married, and he kept making pills and ointments that just really preyed on people's insecurities. And then he, retired. First he started a sanatorium, because of course he did, and he was charging people, £300,000. And then people died. But then, after his wife died from bronchitis, he was like, I know, I'm gonna be a good person. And so he bought a building to educate 250 middle-class ladies. So his customers. But he was really one of the first, big patent medicine dudes. Truly the first big pharma. And all of his pills were said, this Holloway's Family Ointment was supposed to cure asthma, blotches on the skin, colic, constipation, consumption, debility, dysentery, female irregularities, fevers of all kinds, fits, gout, headache, indigestion, inflammation, jaundice, liver complaints, lumbago, piles, rheumatism, retention of urine, sore throats, stone and gravel, secondary symptoms, tumors, ulcers, venereal infections, and worms of all kinds. And he started in his mom's kitchen, like all of us do. And he describes it as using a small saucepan, and a long fish kettle, which held about 40 pounds of liquid, which is crazy. And then after he went to prison, he was like, I'm gonna make pills, they're easier to move. Great. Okay, and people genuinely knew nothing about what was in this until the 1880s, when an article published by the chemist and druggist stated that the pills in the ointment were made up of aloes, rhubarb root, and ginger, with cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, salt, and potassium sulfate that was held together by a confection of roses. So, apparently that was, not crazy and probably wasn't going to hurt people, but also kind of didn't really do anything. So, aloes would be soothing to the skin. Obviously, that's what we use them mostly for. They can also be hydrating when taken internally in pills, but I'm assuming this is mostly about the ointment. Aloe, when applied directly to the skin, can help heal it, and it can also even skin tone. So I'm guessing that's what he was talking about with, evening blotches and soothing aches and pains. Rhubarb root I don't know that it does a ton, but ginger, when applied to the skin, can make things kind of hot. And some people do, I believe, ingest it. It does have anti-inflammatory properties, so I suppose in that way it could help with things like rheumatism, but like venereal diseases, colic, I don't think so. And a lot of these other things like cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, and salt, when applied to the skin, they're just kind of irritating and warming. I'm assuming that would primarily be added for the medicinal smell, especially harkening back to different, like, Eastern medicines that folks probably would have started taking around this time, because medicine was still being greatly influenced by folks who were coming to America to work on the railroad. So I'm assuming that's a big reason. I mean, this is in London, but I mean, it's kind of spread everywhere at that point. We were doing a lot of trading. So I would think that's what those are really there for, and to add color so it looks like there's something. And then a confection of roses. I'm not really sure exactly what they mean by confection. Roses, when ingested, can help be a blood thinner. I don't think that works topically. I don't believe we would absorb it that way. I could be wrong. But I'm assuming that's just kind of like one thing we had plenty of at the time was rose bushes. Rose petals can be blended up into like a paste that holds color pretty well and holds scent. So I would think it was probably just that it's an easy base and something that he could come across cheaply that could be spread onto the skin. But yeah, that's my theory. And this was one of the best selling Victorian ointments that they could find. And they sold it in these little ceramic pots that are actually pretty fun. But yeah, that's how it was marketed. And from what I'm finding, that was pretty typical. A lot of people, and as much as I have fun pointing out people who were like quacks doing really terrible things, the truth about Victorian medicine is a lot of people who were quacks and probably knew their medications weren't helping people. A lot of these people didn't get into the business to harm others. They just didn't want to take on the expense that would come with doing actual research. So they weren't intending harm. They were just doing harm. But yeah, it's definitely a fun little thing. Hopefully sometime we'll be able to dig into this a little bit more when I've done some more research as a non-lightly rooted. And so you guys can see some of these old school Victorian advertisements. They're very fun. I really like them. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it more, but I think that's where we'll leave it for this week. I'll come at you next week with some more tall tales and true histories of plants. See you then. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to the earth, and just like a plant, drink your water. If you liked the show, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at rooted.pod. We're finally updating regularly on YouTube at rooted.podcast, and you can check out our website, rootedpod.com, for transcripts, updates, merch, and so much more. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me. I'm Grebner Gaddis, edited by Kat Friend of Friend Diagram, and our theme music was written and produced by Eric Cluxon. Rooted is a Henbane Media LLC production.